The Dursleys ate dinner at 6:30, and by 7, Harry was clearing the table. This was his routine plates stacked in his left arm, glasses held carefully between his fingers, because the last time one broke, he hadn't sat down for 2 days. He didn't think about the stacking. He was thinking about the boa constrictor. He had been thinking about the boa constrictor, on and off, for nearly 5 weeks. Since the 23rd of June. Since Dudley's birthday, when they had gone to the zoo and Harry had stood at the glass of the reptile house, and the glass had simply gone. Not shattered. Not cracked. Vanished. The way water vanished when you poured it over hot stone, absorbed into nothing, or into somewhere, and the snake had slid out over the sill with a deliberateness that suggested it had been waiting for exactly this, and Harry had been fairly certain, afterward, that it had winked at him. He set the plates in the sink and turned the tap on. Nobody had said anything. That was the thing Harry kept returning to. Dudley had screamed and fallen backwards into the empty tank, and everyone had crowded over to see, and Vernon had gripped Harry's arm hard enough to bruise, and Petunia's face had gone a colour Harry didn't have a name for, and still nobody had said what had actually happened. The glass had vanished, and come back, and the whole family had looked away from it, exactly the way they looked away from the time Harry's hair grew back overnight, after Petunia had cut it to almost nothing, and the time he had somehow ended up on the school roof when Dudley's gang were chasing him, and the time a jumper she was trying to force over his head had shrunk to the size of a flannel, before she could get it past his ears. The water went too cold. He adjusted it without noticing that he had. Dudley was in the garden, doing nothing in the practiced and efficient way of someone who had never once been asked to do anything. He was 11 now. He had a new bicycle, which he had ridden twice, and a new television for his second bedroom, and a birthday that had stretched across most of June the way Dudley's birthdays always did, a long accumulation of gifts and trips and specially prepared meals, each one celebrated and then immediately forgotten. Harry had watched all of it from the edges, and had tried, without success, not to think about the fact that he did not know the exact date of his own birthday. He knew he had one. Everyone had one. He'd asked once, when he was very small, and Petunia had said it was in the summer, and turned back to the sink, and that had been the end of it. He dried his hands and set the folded tea towel over the oven handle. From the sitting room, Vernon's voice came through the wall in its usual bass frequency, commenting on the evening news with the gravity of a man personally aggrieved by world events. Vernon occupied a room even when you couldn't see him. His certainty moved outward like heat from a radiator, warming the people who agreed with him and pressing uncomfortably on everyone else. Harry had spent 10 years navigating around it with the automatic precision of someone who had learned a floor plan in the dark. He went upstairs. The cupboard under the stairs was not on his way to anywhere in the house, but he looked at it as he passed out of old habit-checking, in some animal part of himself, that it was still there. It was. The latch was latched. There was nothing inside it now, except the things that were his, a few clothes, a torch with recently replaced batteries, the school books that Dudley had not managed to destroy, and a toy soldier with a broken arm that Dudley had broken and Harry had kept anyway. He didn't know why he had kept it. He went into the smallest bedroom, which had been Dudley's second bedroom until this spring, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall. The question he kept returning to was not what had happened in the reptile house. It was why. Why the glass? Why the roof? Why the hair? Why the jumper? There was something in him that did these things, some force the word felt both too large and too imprecise, like trying to name a colour he had never seen before, and whatever it was. It did not obey him. It happened around him, and because of him, and in response to him, the way your eyes closed before you had made a conscious decision to close them. He had no language for it, and no one to ask, and no reason to believe, after 10 years of careful silence on the subject, that asking would produce anything except trouble. He lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. He thought, for no particular reason, about his mother. He did this sometimes. He couldn't have said why the woman had no face in his mind, no voice, no weight at all. Petunia did not speak of her. Vernon did not acknowledge that Harry had ever had parents in any meaningful sense. Dudley had apparently absorbed from the atmosphere of the house that the subject did not exist, the same way he had absorbed that certain chairs were Vernon's and certain programs were not to be changed. All Harry had were the pieces they had given him, which amounted almost to nothing. A car crash, an accident. They died before you could remember, don't ask. The woman with no face and no name. He had invented her occasionally when he was very small, the way lonely children invented things. He had mostly stopped. There was no point building something you couldn't verify. He turned onto his side and closed his eyes. In the kitchen, Petunia Dursley stood at the counter long after the sounds of the house had settled around her. She was thin, in the way of a woman who had been tense for a very long time, the particular thinness that came from decades of holding herself carefully together. Her face was long, her neck was long, her large pale eyes were the kind that missed very little and gave very little away. When she was alone, she let them rest on things without the performance of not looking that occupied most of her waking life. She was looking now at the third drawer. She opened it. Under the rubber bands and the Christmas coupons, and the 3 dried-out biro pens she would never discard, and the takeaway menu from the Chinese restaurant they had ordered from once in 1987, and decided against ever again, underneath all of that, there was an envelope. She had put it there herself. She had put it there, and retrieved it, and replaced it so many times over the years that her hand no longer needed to search. It simply went, the way a hand went to a light switch in a room you knew in the dark. She set it on the counter. It was old. You could see it was old from the softening of the paper at the corners, and from the way the envelope itself had worn smooth along its creases, not from damage, but from being opened and refolded too many times, over too many years. The handwriting on the outside was not hers. It was a more deliberate hand, unhurried, the kind of script that people simply did not produce anymore. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she looked toward the hallway, toward the cupboard under the stairs, which was not his bedroom anymore. They had moved him upstairs in the spring. Once it had become clear that the letters would know, but which she still thought of as his bedroom in some reflexive way she had not managed to correct. He was upstairs now. She could hear nothing from that direction, which meant he was probably lying awake in the dark, the way he lay awake most nights, thinking about whatever he thought about, which she had maintained for 10 years now as a firm rule not to wonder. She had been counting since March. The letters came at 11. 11 was in July. She had told herself there was time, there was still time, and she had believed this through the spring and into the summer. She did not entirely believe it now. She pressed her thumb flat against the old envelope. She did not pick it up. She did not put it away. She stood in the quiet kitchen with Vernon's program coming through the wall like noise from a distant and entirely separate life, and she made a decision she had been not making for 10 years. She made it slowly. She made it the way you turned a heavy key with resistance, with both hands, with the full awareness of what you were opening. She had until morning. She could still change her mind. She left the envelope on the counter and turned off the kitchen light. He was almost asleep when she knocked. Not on the cupboard, he was in the small bedroom now, the one upstairs. But the sound was so unexpected at this hour that for a moment he lay completely still and convinced himself he had imagined it. Then it came again. 2 knocks. Quiet, with a deliberateness that was not Vernon's style at all. Vernon announced himself through volume. This was something else. "Come downstairs," Petunia said, through the door. Quietly, Harry sat up. The house was dark, in the way it got after 11 Vernon's programs finished, and the television off, and all the ordinary noise of the evening settled into silence. He could hear nothing from Dudley's room. He pulled on his glasses and went downstairs in his socks, one hand on the banister, trying to identify what he had done wrong in the last 24 hours, and coming up with nothing specific, which was usually more alarming than something specific. Petunia was sitting at the kitchen table. She had the overhead light on, which she almost never did at this hour. She preferred lamps. The overhead light was unforgiving, and she knew it, which meant she had not turned it on for ambiance. She had turned it on because she wanted to see clearly. She was sitting very straight, the way she sat when she was maintaining something with effort, and on the table in front of her were 2 envelopes. Harry stood in the doorway. "Sit down," she said. He sat down across from her. The table between them was the ordinary kitchen table with the coffee ring that wouldn't come out, and the chip in the corner from when Dudley had thrown a fork. It looked different at this hour, in this light, with Petunia sitting across it, looking at him like she was about to say something she had rehearsed. She put her hand flat on the envelope closest to her. It was the old one. He had seen it on the counter before he went up. The other one was newer, he thought, or at least looked less worn. "I want to tell you something," she said, "before you hear it from someone else." He waited. She looked at the envelope under her hand for a moment, and then she looked back at him, and her expression was the one she used when she was being precise. Not warm, not cold. Precise. "When I was a girl," she said, "I wrote a letter to the headmaster of a school for witches and wizards." She stopped. The word seemed to cost her something, though her voice did not change. "I asked him if I could attend." The kitchen was very quiet. "What school?" Harry asked. He didn't know why he asked it. It was perhaps the least important part of what she had just said. But it was the question that came out. "Hogwarts." She said the word the way you said a word you had not said aloud in a very long time. "Your mother went there. She was a witch. She went to that school for 7 years. She paused. Her name was Lily. Harry had been called a lot of things. He had been called boy and freak, and his name, of course, which he had never heard said particularly kindly. He had been given information about his parents before. "They died in a car crash. They didn't leave you anything. Don't ask again." But he had never been told his mother's name. Not like this. Not as a fact, being placed in front of him like something real. "Lily." He looked at Petunia. She was looking at the table. "She wrote back to the headmaster first," she said, after a moment, meaning his mother. "She told me to write to him myself, so I did." Her jaw shifted slightly. "I was 9 years old." She pushed the older envelope toward him. He didn't pick it up. "And he wrote back," she said, indicating the second envelope. "Very kindly. He said that I wasn't a witch. He said the school was for students with magical ability, and that I didn't have it. And he was very sorry." She smoothed the edge of the newer envelope with one finger. It was a kind letter. "But he said no," Harry said. "He said no," Petunia agreed. The quietness in her voice was not the quietness of someone who had made peace with something. It was the quietness of someone who had had a long time to practice not saying what they felt. Harry understood the difference. He had spent most of his life cultivating the same kind of quiet. He looked at the old envelope under her hand. Her letter, the one she had written to the headmaster when she was 9 years old. She had kept it for, he worked out the arithmetic, more than 20 years. He couldn't quite hold that in his mind. "What happened to my parents?" he said. "Really?" She was still for a moment. Longer than usual. He watched something pass across her face and be suppressed before he could name it. "They didn't die in a car crash," she said. "I know." That surprised her. He could see it, the small shift at the corners of her eyes. "A man wanted them dead," she said, and something in her voice changed frequency, went lower. He wanted a great many people dead, as it happened. There was a war. She stopped, started again. "He came for them specifically. He came for your father first, then for your mother. Then he tried to kill you, and he couldn't. And after that, he was—" She paused for the last time. "Gone. He's been gone for 10 years. You don't need to be afraid of him." "What was his name?" The look on her face told him she knew the name. She had known it for 10 years, and she was not going to say it at this table, in this kitchen, at this hour. She simply shook her head, once, and that was the answer. "What was my father?" Harry asked. "A wizard," she said, with a flatness that held old judgment in it, like sediment at the bottom of still water. "From a wizarding family. He was—" She seemed to weigh something. "He had very untidy black hair. He wore glasses." Her eyes moved to Harry's face for a moment, and then away again. "You take after him." Harry looked down at his hands, thin. Smaller than they ought to be for his age, probably. Dudley's hands were large and pink and belonged to someone who had never not been fed enough. His own hands looked like someone else's. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Before now." "Because it didn't concern you yet," she said, "and it concerns me now." "Yes," said Petunia. She looked at him steadily. "It concerns you now." She gathered the envelopes from the table. He had not touched either of them. She held them for a moment, and then, carefully, with the same hands that had clearly handled these particular objects many times before, she put them back in their arrangement, the older inside the newer, and placed them together. "I did not beg him," she said, without preamble. "Whatever else you might think, whatever it might look like. I wrote a reasonable letter asking a reasonable question, and he answered it. I was 9 years old, and I wrote a reasonable letter." Her voice was very level. The levelness was the thing that stayed with him, later. "I want you to know that." "I know that," Harry said. She looked at him. He thought she was going to say something else. Instead, she stood, tucking the envelopes against her chest. "Go back to bed," she said. "The post comes in the morning." She left the kitchen before he did. He sat at the ordinary table for another minute, in the overhead light that she had left on for him to turn off himself, and he thought about a woman named Lily who had told her sister to write to the headmaster of a school. He thought about a 9-year-old girl writing to a man she did not know, asking for something she was not going to be given. He thought about the fact that Petunia had written that letter and kept it for more than 20 years, and had never, in all that time, thrown it away. He turned off the light and went upstairs. He did not sleep. He lay on his back in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, and his mind would not stop its catalogue. He kept starting from the beginning and working through it methodically, the way you checked your schoolwork. Her name was Lily. She was a witch. She went to Hogwarts. She had dark red hair and green eyes. And each time he reached the end of what he knew, the last fact sat there waiting, and he had to start from the beginning again. Lily. He had not known she had a name. This was the first thing that kept stopping him. Not the school, not the magic, not the man who had wanted them dead. He had not known she had a name that was also a word. He had not known she had red hair. He had not known that her eyes were green, which meant he had not known, until this moment, why his own eyes were green, because no one in the Dursley household had green eyes. He had spent 10 years living in a house full of blue and brown and pale grey, and his own eyes had simply been his own eyes, unexplained. He pressed the back of his hand against his glasses, and then put them back on and stared at the ceiling again. She was a witch. She had gone to a school called Hogwarts. She had been brilliant, some part of him supplied, though Petunia had not said that. What Petunia had actually said was, she went there for 7 years. Her name was Lily. She had not offered anything more than that. But the fact of the school and the 7 years and the name were enough to start building on. He had not had anything before. Now he had these things. He thought about Petunia at 9 years old. This was the image he could not put down. A child sitting somewhere, writing a letter to a headmaster she had never met at a school she had never attended, asking to be admitted. The headmaster had answered. He had answered kindly, Petunia had said, very kindly, which meant the letter had been read by a real person who had taken it seriously enough to reply to, and who had understood what it must have cost to write, and had said no anyway, as gently as possible, and the no had stayed with Petunia for more than 20 years. Harry tried to map the image of the 9-year-old onto the person he knew. He could not quite do it. The Petunia he knew was sharp-edged and careful, a person of precise economy. She parcelled out her attention, her speech, her space in a room, as though waste were a moral failing. She did not reach toward things. She managed them. But a child writing to a headmaster was reaching, which meant that somewhere inside the managing there was a person who had once reached, who had been 9 years old, and written a letter because she wanted something badly enough to ask a stranger for it. The 9-year-old had become the woman at the kitchen table. Harry didn't know how, exactly. He kept trying to see the path between them. He lay there a long time. At some point, the house settled further into its nighttime sounds. The pipes, the faint tick of something cooling in the kitchen, the breathing of a building that was asleep, even if he wasn't. He thought about the man who had come for his parents. Petunia had said he was gone. She had said, "You don't need to be afraid of him," which was a different thing from saying he was dead, though he might be. She had said, a man wanted them dead. He had wanted a great many people dead. He had been a kind of war, Harry understood. He had been a one-man catastrophe, or the centre of a catastrophe, and his parents had been caught in it, and Harry had survived it, and for 10 years nobody had said any of this because the rule was silence. His hair regrowing, the roof, the jumper, the boa constrictor at the zoo. He lay still and thought about these things one by one, and they felt different now. Not different in what they were. They were still strange, still inexplicable by any mechanism he had, but different in what they meant. Before tonight, they had been his private catalogue of wrongness, the evidence that something in him didn't work the way it was supposed to. Now they were evidence of something else. They were inheritance. He was a witch's son. The thing that kept happening around him was the same thing that had happened around her. Probably, before she had any more language for it than he did. He thought, she must have been frightened too, before she knew. And then he thought, she had a sister who knew before she did. And the sister had never told him. This thought arrived quietly and sat there. He did not know what to do with it yet. Just before the light behind the curtain began to change from black to grey, he came back to the kitchen table. To Petunia's voice saying, "I did not beg." He had believed her when she said it, had believed her instantly and completely, which surprised him a little, because she wasn't a person he was in the habit of believing. But he did believe her. He could not imagine the woman who had sat across from him tonight, begging for anything. She had said, "I made a reasonable request." She had said, "I was 9 years old." And the steadiness in her voice, when she said it, was not the steadiness of someone who had made peace. It was the steadiness of someone who had decided, decades ago, how this particular fact was going to be held, and had held it that way ever since. The pride and the longing were both in her. He understood that much. They lived together in the same person, and they had produced the same result for 20 years. Silence, and a letter in the third drawer, and nothing said to anyone. He didn't have words for what he understood yet. It was more a shape than a thought. But he turned it over carefully in his mind, and let himself fall, finally, into something close to sleep. The post came at 7:30. Harry was in the kitchen when it arrived, standing at the cooker with the sausages. This was one of his tasks on weekday mornings, and he heard the letter slot open and close in the hallway. He heard Vernon move toward it, the way Vernon always moved toward the morning post, with the heavy-footed certainty of a man who expected the day to proceed on his schedule. Then there was a pause. Harry kept his eyes on the sausages. He turned them carefully with the tongs, and did not look up. "Boy," Vernon said, from the hallway doorway. His voice had a quality Harry recognized, the particular compression of someone keeping something large inside a small sound. "These are for you." He set the letter on the counter without coming any further into the kitchen. Harry did not reach for it immediately. He turned the heat down on the sausages and wiped his hands on the tea towel and looked at it. The envelope was thick, yellowish parchment, sealed on the back with purple wax. The wax had been pressed with a coat of arms. He could see that much from where he stood, though he couldn't make out the detail. The address on the front was written in green ink. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4. Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He looked at it. The cupboard. Not the bedroom. The cupboard. Whoever had written this had known, or had had it recorded somewhere, that he slept in the cupboard under the stairs. He did not know how. He did not know who kept those kinds of records, or when this particular record had been made. But it meant the school had been watching long enough to know where he slept. He reached for the envelope. Vernon's hand came down on it first. It happened quickly. Vernon crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took the letter off the counter and tore it in half. Then, because half was apparently not enough, he tore it again and dropped the pieces into the bin under the sink and straightened and looked at Harry with an expression that was half warning and half something that might, on a different face, have been fear. "That's enough of that," said Vernon. Harry said nothing. He could feel Petunia behind him. She had appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point, drawn by the sound or by the knowledge of what was coming. He didn't turn to look at her. She didn't look at him. He knew this without seeing it. He felt the deliberate quality of her not looking, the way you felt a sound in a room that had just stopped. Vernon went to get his coat and briefcase and the morning newspaper, in that order, and then the front door closed, and the house held the particular quiet of a thing that has just happened in it. Harry turned back to the cooker. The sausages needed attending. He attended to them. Petunia moved into the kitchen and filled the kettle and switched it on. and the sound of water heating was the only sound between them. He put the sausages onto a plate and called up the stairs for Dudley, and set the plate on the table and went to the sink to wash the pan. He washed it slowly. He thought about the pieces of yellowish parchment in the bin. He thought about green ink. He thought about the letter that would come tomorrow. Because it would come tomorrow, he was certain of this in the same way he was certain of things he could not explain, but could not argue with either. It would come tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because a school that had known about the cupboard was not going to be deterred by a man in a suit tearing its mail. He washed the pan and set it on the drying rack, and stood there with his hands in the cooling water. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow it would come again. The second letter arrived on Wednesday, the third on Thursday, and by Friday there were 12. Harry watched all of it from the position he had occupied his entire life, the edges of things. He carried plates and washed pans and made himself scarce in the way that 10 years of practice had made automatic, and he watched the letters come. They were addressed the same way. To the cupboard, not the bedroom. The school had not updated its records. And they came through the letterbox in the morning, and Vernon collected them with a face that was getting harder to read. Not the normal face. Not the football scores face, or the late-for-work face. Something more compressed than those. Something that was working to contain more than it usually contained. He didn't know what the letters said. He had never held one. But he knew what they were. That was the thing that changed everything, and kept changing it every time a new batch arrived. In any version of this week where Petunia had stayed silent, Harry would have been mystified, would have watched Vernon's behavior escalate from irritable to strange to frantic, and had no framework for it. He would have been in the dark, trying to read signs he didn't understand. Instead, he stood in the kitchen on Friday morning and watched Vernon carry 12 identical thick envelopes to the kitchen bin and tear them one by one, and he understood each tear with a clarity that felt almost like hearing. The wizarding world was trying to tell him something he already knew. It did not know that yet. It was going to keep trying. Petunia was at the sink when Vernon left for work. She watched the car back out of the drive and stood there for a moment with her hand still in the water, not washing anything. She had been carrying it since Monday night, the fact of what she had done, not as a weight exactly, but as a change in the air pressure of the house. Vernon did not know. This was the part that required the most careful management. Vernon moved through the week with his ordinary certainties, his ordinary complaints, and his ordinary bewilderment at the letters, while Petunia watched him and said nothing. She had told Harry, and not told Vernon. This was not the order she would have chosen if she had been choosing tidily. But she had not been choosing tidily. She had been standing in the kitchen with the envelope under her hand and the knowledge that the letters were coming, and she had made a decision in the way that people made decisions when they had been putting something off for years and could not put it off any further. The letters were coming regardless. She had simply rearranged the order of things. She dried her hands. Harry knew, and Vernon did not, and the letters kept arriving, and somewhere inside all of that, Petunia had given her nephew the only thing she had ever had that was both hers and Lily's, the evidence that she had wanted it too. She did not examine this thought. She set it down somewhere she would not have to look at it, and went to make the beds. On Sunday there were 30. They came through the letterbox in a sustained rush, like something that had been held back and now released. Letter after letter, that same thick yellowish parchment, that same green ink, the Hogwarts seal pressed in purple wax, each one addressed to Harry with the same specificity that was beginning to feel less like administration and more like insistence. Harry watched from the stairs. Vernon stood in the hallway with an expression Harry had never seen on him before. Not anger, exactly, though there was anger in it. Something more unsettled, something that looked, at its edges, like a man who was starting to believe in something he had spent years not believing in. He gathered them all and took them to the garden and burned them in the metal bin. Harry watched through the kitchen window. The smoke went straight up in the still morning air. The kitchen was empty. Petunia had taken Dudley upstairs for something. Harry could hear Dudley's voice above, requiring attention the way Dudley always required attention, which was as a background fact of the house, like gravity. Harry turned from the window. Petunia had come back downstairs without him hearing. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching him. He turned and she was there, and neither of them had anywhere to redirect their attention. There was no cupboard to check, no pan on the cooker, no reasonable reason to look somewhere else. They looked at each other. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Less. He could not have said what passed between them exactly. It wasn't language, and it wasn't the absence of language either. It was something else. The acknowledgement of a shared thing in a house full of people who didn't share it. The particular quality of two people who are the only ones in a room who know what is happening. Petunia's face did not soften. It did not warm. But it did not do the thing it usually did when she looked at him, which was to look slightly past him, as though he occupied a space that she preferred not to focus on directly. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then Dudley called again from upstairs and she left, and Harry turned back to the window, and Vernon was still in the garden, watching things burn. By Tuesday, Vernon had nailed the mail slot shut. By Wednesday, letters were coming under the doors, through gaps in the window frames, tucked inside the delivery of eggs and the morning milk. Pressed flat, slid through any gap that offered itself, the whole enterprise taking on the quality of a natural force rather than a postal service. On Thursday he announced that they were leaving. He did not say where. He said it was temporary. He said this with the conviction of a man who had convinced himself that physical distance was the solution to a problem that was not fundamentally physical. Harry packed what he needed in the way he had always packed when required to go somewhere with the Dursleys quickly, the things that mattered most inside anything else, hoping nothing would be searched. He put his school books at the bottom of the bag, under a jumper. They went to a hotel first. Letters arrived at the hotel desk within 6 hours. Vernon paid in cash, and they left. The car trip to the coast was long and silent, or silent in the way things were silent in the Dursley household, which was not quiet, exactly, since Vernon commented on the road, and Dudley wanted to know when they would arrive, and the radio played for stretches before Vernon snapped it off, but which contained no actual communication between anyone. Harry sat in the back and watched Petunia. Her face, in profile from the back seat, the long jaw, the large eye she presented when she was looking out the window, the particular set of her neck and shoulders that he realized, watching it, was not the same as her usual set. She was not frightened. He had seen Petunia frightened before, or something close to it. She had a way of going very still and sharp-eyed when something worried her, a compression of attention that Vernon often didn't notice because he was usually the source of it. This was not that. She looked across the long miles of countryside in the rain, tired. A different quality of tired than he was used to seeing in her. Not the tiredness of someone who had done a great deal that day, but the tiredness of someone who had been doing something for a very long time and was still doing it. He had not thought about that before. He thought about it now. The hut on the rock was at the end of a boat trip Harry did not fully register, except as motion and cold spray and the sound of water. It was small and smelled of salt and something damp beneath the salt, and the wind outside made the whole structure feel less permanent than structures were supposed to feel. There were 2 rooms. Dudley assessed this situation and produced a response commensurate with his assessment. Vernon set about establishing an authority over the hut that the hut did not particularly acknowledge. Petunia unpacked what there was to unpack. Harry found a corner and sat in it, and watched the storm through the dirty window. He knew what was coming. Not every detail. He didn't know who would come or exactly what they would say. Petunia had said, "The school sends someone." She had said it in the way she said things that she knew from sources she would not name, which meant she had been told, probably by Dumbledore's letter in 1981, that the wizarding world handled its own. She had believed this for 10 years, and complied with it for 10 years, and now here they were, on a rock in the sea, and Harry was almost 11, and midnight was not very far away. He leaned his head against the cold wall, and watched the storm, and counted down. The storm had not let up. Harry sat with his back against the wall, and his knees pulled up, and listened to the sea throwing itself at the rock below them, and counted. He had been counting since the hut went quiet, since Vernon had finished his complaints, and Dudley had eaten the last of the crisps, and both of them had fallen asleep on the one decent mattress, as though the universe had arranged itself around their comfort, which in Harry's experience it largely had. Petunia lay very still near the window, or appeared to. Harry was not certain she was asleep. He did not look at the clock. He didn't need to. The counting was not the kind that required numbers. It was the kind that was just awareness of time passing, of getting closer to something. At some point after midnight, he turned 11. He sat with that for a moment. He had been 10 for the last time. He could not, sitting in a rattling hut on a rock in a storm at midnight on his birthday, articulate what that meant. Only that 10 felt suddenly very far away, and that 10 had been the year someone had told him his mother's name, and that seemed like the right year for that to have happened. Something ought to mark the end of not knowing, even if the mark was nothing more than a number changing over. Then the door came off its hinges. Not knocked, not opened with any particular mechanism. It simply came inward as though it had always meant to, pushed by a hand that did not appear to have exerted much effort, and in the doorway stood a person of such impossible dimensions that for one fraction of a second Harry's mind genuinely could not process what it was looking at. The man, and it was at some level a man, was taller than the door frame by a clear margin, and twice as wide as the gap he had just widened, wrapped in a coat so large it might have served as lodging for a family of reasonable size, with a beard so thick and wild and black that his face was largely theoretical behind it. He was carrying a pink umbrella. He ducked through the doorway and straightened as much as the ceiling permitted, and looked around the hut with small black eyes that were, Harry noticed, very kind. The noise woke Dudley and Vernon. Dudley screamed. Vernon lurched to his feet from the mattress and knocked over the lamp, which broke. In the sudden scramble, Petunia sat up and was still. The man looked down at Harry. "You're a wizard, Harry," he said, in a voice like a very large dog deciding to be friendly. Harry looked up at him. "I know," he said. The silence that followed was different from the silences Harry was used to. It was not the silence of something being suppressed. It was the silence of a man whose entire prepared approach had just become inapplicable. "You." The man stopped. He looked down at Harry with an expression rearranging itself from the one it had planned to wear. "Who told you?" "My aunt." The man's small eyes moved across the hut. They found Petunia, who was sitting very upright near the window with her hands in her lap, and her face arranged into nothing readable. He looked at her for what seemed like a long time. Something moved across his face, something complex that Harry couldn't name, less surprise than a kind of recognition of a fact he had not anticipated. Petunia looked back at him. She did not say anything. She did not look away. He looked back at Harry. He cleared his throat. Then he put his hand inside the enormous coat and produced, from one of what appeared to be a great many pockets, a box. He set it on the floor in front of Harry. It was slightly squashed on one corner. The box. It had clearly been transported in a way that boxes were not designed for. "Happy birthday," the man said, and his voice had shifted to something softer. "First things first." Harry opened the box. Inside was a cake. It was large and round, and clearly made by someone to whom icing was a technique they were still developing. The green letters across the top read, "Happy Birthday, Harry," compressed at the right side, where the writer had miscalculated the space. It was the most improbable thing Harry had seen in a week full of improbable things. He looked at it for a moment and couldn't quite speak. He had not had a birthday cake before. He had not thought about this as a fact that carried any particular weight. He thought about it now. "Thank you," he said. "Rubeus Hagrid," the man said, as though just remembering, and thrust out an enormous hand that Harry shook, feeling his own hand disappear. "Keeper of Keys at Hogwarts, and I've got your letter here, if you want to. Well, you know what it says, seemingly." He looked at Harry with something that was working its way toward amusement. "Mostly." "Can you read it anyway?" Harry asked. "I want to hear it." Hagrid read it. He read the whole of it, all the subjects listed and the supplies required, and Harry followed each line and asked questions at the ones Petunia hadn't covered. He asked about potions and transfiguration and the defense against the dark arts, names he had read on the spines of his school books, abstract until now, made less abstract by hearing a real person say them in a hut on a rock, where they had clearly arrived with some intention of staying. Hagrid answered each question with the enthusiasm of a person who found the information genuinely interesting, and slightly surprised that someone else did too. At some point in the middle of this, Vernon cleared his throat. "Now, see here." Hagrid glanced at him. He did not appear to do anything else, but something in the quality of the glance caused Vernon to stop and reconsider. Vernon was a large man. Hagrid was in an entirely different category of large. Vernon tried twice more over the following half hour, once more with his voice, once with a physical motion toward Hagrid that terminated itself before completing, and both times arrived at the same conclusion and retreated to the mattress to conduct his objection from there. At a certain point, he went quiet. "I know they didn't die in a car crash," Harry said. He said it during a pause when Hagrid had set down the letter and was rummaging in another pocket for something. "My parents, I know that." Hagrid went still for a moment. "Your aunt tell you that too?" "She said a man wanted them dead. She said he's gone now." "He is." Hagrid's voice had taken on a different weight. He was looking at Harry with an expression Harry had not seen directed at him before. Careful and sad, and something else underneath those things that he couldn't name yet. "Your mum and dad were brilliant people, Harry. Bravest I ever knew." He paused. "I was the one brought you here, that night. Took you from the house." He stopped himself. There was something he was not saying, and Harry decided not to press it. Not tonight. The man who done it. His name was Voldemort. From across the hut, Petunia made a sound. It was not a word. It was very small, barely audible under the noise of the storm, and Dudley's restless sleeping. But it was there, a small, involuntary thing that her control had not quite caught in time. She knew the name. Of course she knew the name. She had known it for 10 years at minimum, probably longer, and she had stood in the kitchen and said a man, and never, not once, named him. Harry did not look at her. He let the moment pass. Hagrid stayed. He settled himself onto the floor. Most of the hut's actual floor space was occupied by his coat, and drank tea from a pot he produced from his coat pocket, and ate several of what appeared to be rock cakes from another. And by degrees the noise and energy of the arrival subsided into something more like an ordinary late evening, if ordinary could be applied to any of this. Vernon went to sleep eventually. Dudley had been asleep for a while. The storm went on outside. Harry held the Hogwarts letter and read it again. At some point he looked across the hut. Petunia had turned toward the wall. Her face was not visible. The line of her shoulder and the back of her head were what he could see, and from those there was nothing to read, except that she had decided not to face the room. He looked at her for a moment, and then looked back at the letter. He thought about a man who had known her sister, who had brought him here on the night everything changed, who had said, in a voice like a large dog being kind, that his mother was the bravest person he'd ever known. The first external confirmation. It landed the way first confirmations landed, not as new information because it confirmed what he already knew, but as a change in the quality of the knowing. What Petunia had given him had been words in a kitchen at midnight. What Hagrid had just given him was someone who had been there. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket, and sat with the storm, and let himself believe all of it. Morning came grey and salt-smelling. The storm reduced overnight to a steady rain that pattered against the hut's single window with the persistence of something that had not finished yet. Hagrid made breakfast. This turned out to involve a fire that he coaxed into existence in the stone hearth with a pointed look at his pink umbrella, and a pan of sausages that he managed without apparent difficulty, despite the pan being designed for someone considerably smaller than he was. The sausages were slightly burned on the outside and perfectly good otherwise. Harry ate his sitting on the floor. Dudley, after a period of staring at Hagrid from the farthest possible corner of the hut, had been persuaded by the smell of food that the situation might be navigable. Vernon had not come out of the other room. "Your mum," Hagrid said, when most of the sausages were gone. He said it without preamble, the way he said most things, as though the thought had arrived, and there was no particular reason to delay it. "I expect your aunt told you some of it. Last night you knew more than most kids do coming to Hogwarts for the first time." He looked at Harry sideways, the small black eyes assessing something. "What did she tell you?" "That her name was Lily," Harry said. "That she was a witch. That she went to Hogwarts." He paused. "That's mostly what she said." Hagrid nodded slowly, turning the remaining sausage over in the pan. "She was brilliant," he said. "Your mum? Brightest in her year by most accounts. Brilliant at charms, brilliant at potions, bravest too." "I knew her. Not well, mind. I'm not a teacher, but I see the students. I saw her. She had this way of—" He stopped. He seemed to be looking at something on the floor of the hut that wasn't there. "She looked nothing like you, except the eyes. The eyes were exactly yours. Or yours are hers, I suppose, which is the right way round." Harry thought about that for a moment. "Did she like it?" he asked. "Hogwarts." "Loved it," Hagrid said without hesitation. "From the first day. Some kids take a term or two to find their feet. Your mum walked in like she'd been there before." Harry did not say, "I want that." But he thought it. and held it carefully, and put it somewhere he would be able to find it later. He thought about the potions. He asked, after a moment, who taught it. Hagrid had mentioned it, and the supply list he'd read the night before had the textbooks for it, but not a name to go with them. Hagrid's expression shifted into something guarded. It happened quickly, and then resolved back into his usual open manner, but Harry caught the interval. "You'll meet your teachers at school," Hagrid said. "That's really more of a... They'll introduce themselves proper at the start of term." He picked up the pan and set it aside. More than enough time to know 'em then. It was not a full answer. Harry noted this and put it beside the potion sausage and let the subject go. They left the rock mid-morning. Hagrid borrowed a boat from somewhere, and they crossed back to the mainland in the rain. And then there was a considerable amount of ordinary transport that Hagrid navigated with a cheerful disregard for how conspicuous he was. People stared, but Hagrid either didn't notice or had stopped caring a long time ago. And after a while, Harry found he didn't notice either. London appeared around them in the way London appeared when you arrived from the south, gradually and then all at once. The Leaky Cauldron was on Charing Cross Road. Harry would not have found it himself. He walked past the frontage twice before Hagrid put a hand on his shoulder and steered him toward a door that Harry's eyes kept wanting to slide away from, as though looking at it directly required an effort he hadn't been asked to make before. Inside was dark and low-ceilinged, and the people inside it were various, was the word Harry arrived at, in the way that a place is various when its customers have come from somewhere with a wider definition of what people looked like than the one Harry had grown up with. They noticed Hagrid with the affection of people noticing something familiar. Several of them noticed Harry, and their expressions did something complicated. He kept moving. The back courtyard was empty in the rain. Hagrid tapped the brick wall with the pink umbrella, and Harry watched a section of it spiral outward, like a shutter, and reveal, beyond it, a street that was absolutely, completely, immediately unlike anything else he had seen. He stood at the entrance to Diagon Alley and looked, and the word that arrived was not any word he had ready. It was something that did not have language yet. Gringotts first. The bank was white marble and very tall, staffed by beings that were clearly not human and did not appear to require Harry's opinion on this point. Hagrid presented some paperwork, or something serving the function of paperwork, and there was a cart and a descent that Harry's stomach treated as an event. And then Vault 687. The door opened, and the torchlight fell inside. Harry had not thought about the gold. He had thought about his parents being dead, and about Voldemort, and about the school, and about Petunia writing to a headmaster at the age of 9, and in all of that, he had not thought about. They might have left something. He stood in the doorway and looked at the piles of gold coins. Galleons, Hagrid said, the large ones, and felt something he couldn't name. It was not what the gold was. It was what it meant. James Potter had earned this, had kept it here, had left it without knowing he was leaving it, or maybe knowing and not being able to stop the leaving. Harry's father had stood in this vault, possibly, at some point before October 31st, 1981, and the gold had been there then, and was still here now. He took what they needed, and looked at nothing else on the way out. He had his robes fitted at Madame Malkin's without incident. A woman in mauve robes measured him while Hagrid waited outside, and the robes were nothing remarkable, just fabric. And he bought his books at Flourish and Blott's, and his other supplies from various shops whose names he was not certain he'd remember. And through all of it, he carried the fact Hagrid had given him that morning, like a stone in his palm. Brilliant at potions. From the first day, loved it. She looked nothing like you except the eyes. He was not buying supplies for a stranger's life. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Other children probably arrived here and bought these things, and they were simply objects, A pewter cauldron, glass phials, a telescope, brass scales. Just equipment for a subject, practical and impersonal. For Harry, they were something else. They were the tools of something inherited. His mother had held these things, or things exactly like them, and found her way into the world through them. And here he was in the same street buying the same objects for the same reason. And he had not known any of this 11 days ago. Ollivander's was last. The shop was narrow, and the shelves ran floor to ceiling, and the shelves were full of narrow boxes stacked in their thousands. And Mr. Ollivander was a pale man, with wide silver eyes that gave the impression of paying more attention than was comfortable. He did not appear surprised to see Harry, which was beginning to seem like a category that contained fewer people in it than Harry had assumed. He tried wands. Many wands. He tried them in the sequence that Ollivander directed, which did not appear to follow any logic Harry could identify, except the logic of Ollivander himself. Each wand picked up and each one produced nothing, or a brief warm sensation, or a shower of sparks from the wrong end. Ollivander retrieved each one with the thoughtful expression of someone who was narrowing something. "Holly," he said at last, "and phoenix feather, 11 inches. Rather supple." He placed it in Harry's hand. The warmth moved through his fingers and up his arm, and the air in the small shop stirred, and Harry was not certain what had happened, except that everything felt, for one moment, exactly the right size. Ollivander looked at him across the counter with those very wide eyes. "I think," he said, "we can expect great things from you, Mr. Potter." He paused. After all, he who must not be named did great things. Terrible, yes, but great. Harry paid the 7 galleons and went outside. Hagrid was waiting. He looked at Harry's expression and asked if he was all right. And Harry said yes, he was fine. He thought about what Ollivander had said, about the man who had killed his parents being great in the way catastrophes were great. And then he thought about his mother being brilliant at potions and decided to put one of those things down and carry the other. He chose the potions. The train back to Little Whinging was ordinary and took an ordinary length of time, and Harry sat with his trunk in the overhead rack and his new wand in his pocket and thought about very little. The family would have returned to Privet Drive by now. Hagrid had said this with confidence, in the way he said things that were simply going to be true. Harry watched the outskirts of London become suburbs, and then something more familiar, and held his holly wand through his pocket the whole way, feeling the warmth of it through the cloth, and thought about September 1st. He came back with a trunk. Petunia was in the sitting room when she heard the front door and the particular sound of something heavy being set down in the hallway, and she knew before she went to look. She had known it was coming, had known since July. Since before July, had been knowing it for the better part of a decade. But knowing and seeing were different operations, and she stood in the sitting-room doorway and looked at the trunk in her hallway and felt the difference. It was an ordinary trunk, banded, dark wood, lock on the front, the kind that suggested long journeys and items folded carefully. There were things inside it that did not belong to the house at Privet Drive, or to anything she had built here. She could feel that without opening it. Harry was standing beside it. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke. Then she went back to the sitting room and picked up what she had been doing, and did not think about the trunk in the hallway, because thinking about it was not something she had agreed to do. It did not go back in the hallway. At some point during the evening, Harry moved it upstairs, and after that it lived in his room, and Petunia did not go to look at it. August arranged itself around them. Dudley had started secondary school, which meant the house was quieter in the mornings, quieter by Dudley's particular subtraction, which was considerable. He moved through rooms with a sound and presence that filled the available space, so his absence during school hours left something the other family members spread into without quite noticing. The house was slightly more breathable. Petunia recognized this and did not comment on it because some observations were not worth the explanation they would require. Harry read. She noticed this from the beginning and watched it from various doorways over the following weeks, trying to identify what was different about the way he read now compared to before. He had always read. She had not stopped that. Books were books, and it would have been unreasonable to stop books. But he had read the way children read when they were lonely, to get somewhere else. What he was doing now was different. He sat at the kitchen table or on the stairs or in the small chair by the window in his room, and he read his school books with the concentrated attention of someone building something. He moved between them, the potions text, then the transfiguration, then the defense against the dark arts, then back to the potions. He took no notes as far as she could see. He appeared to be memorizing the shape of things. She watched this from doorways and said nothing. The rule for 10 years had been clear. No questions, no curiosity, no looking at anything sideways. She had enforced this the way she enforced all domestic rules, with a consistency she had learned was the only reliable tool. She had enforced it because the alternative was a conversation she had not been ready to have, and then because the longer she didn't have it, the more impossible it became, and then because she had forgotten, somewhere in the middle of all the years, that she had originally made a choice about it at all. The rule had lapsed. She had been the one to lapse it. She was aware of this. Harry sat at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon and read about potions, and she came in and made tea and went out again, and neither of them acknowledged that this was happening. Vernon came home at 6 and commented on the traffic, and Dudley came down for dinner, and the 4 of them ate with the television on, and Vernon did not notice that anything was different. This was the quality of Vernon's certainty that Petunia lived inside, month after month, year after year. Absolute. He believed what he had decided to believe with a thoroughness that foreclosed revision. The world he carried in his head was the world he moved through. And when those two things diverged, as they had been diverging, she thought, for a very long time, it was the world that adjusted in his accounting, not his head. He looked at Harry reading wizarding textbooks at his kitchen table and processed this as a boy doing schoolwork, which was a category that satisfied him, and turned back to the news. Petunia watched him not notice. There was something that was almost funny about it, in the dark way that certain things were funny. The way a very large ship failing to see a very small lighthouse was almost funny. She did not laugh. She drank her tea and watched Vernon not notice, and thought about what it would look like if she explained. She did not explain. Harry closed the potions textbook one evening and went to look for something else, and Petunia happened to be standing at the kitchen window when he came in. The garden was dark. The neighbor's light was on across the fence, and she was looking at it without seeing it, doing the particular kind of not thinking that occupied most of her evenings now. What was she like? Harry asked. She did not ask who he meant. She stood at the window a moment longer. The neighbor's light. The dark garden. She thought about not answering, turned the option over briefly and set it aside, the way she set aside things she was not going to do, but wanted to have the choice of. She was impossible, Petunia said. She could feel him waiting. She did not look at him. She made everything look easy, she said. Things that weren't easy. She stopped. She had not spoken about this to anyone, ever, in the precise way she was about to speak about it, and her voice knew this, and slowed accordingly. She walked into rooms, and things rearranged themselves. Not by magic, just, she had that. She stopped again. She was not going to say more than that. He seemed to understand, or he understood enough. She heard him not pressing, which was its own kind of intelligence, and after a moment she heard him leave the kitchen. She stood at the window a little longer. Impossible. She had chosen that word with care, not because she had planned to choose it, but because when the moment came, it was the most accurate one available. Lily had been impossible in the specific sense of being beyond what was reasonable to encounter in a person. Too much talent in too casual a hand, too much warmth distributed too freely, making the people around her feel simultaneously elevated and diminished. Petunia had spent a great deal of her life being diminished. She had not always known whether she was also elevated. She hadn't said that part. She wasn't going to. Harry went upstairs. He did not resent the small bedroom the way he had resented the cupboard. Or he resented it differently, if he still resented it. She was not certain he did. She had moved him out of the cupboard in the spring, and she had not explained the reason, because the reason was that a letter addressed to the cupboard was coming, and she preferred not to have it arrive with quite that specificity. He had not asked. He had moved his things upstairs in one trip without comment, and that had been that. The room was still too small, and the furniture was still what Dudley had not wanted. But there was a window, and he could see out of it. And what was outside the window was a date in September that he was moving toward. He was leaving. She was aware of this at all times now, the way you were aware of weather coming. Not a thought exactly, more a quality of the air. At the end of August, she went into his room while he was downstairs and opened the trunk. She packed it. She put the books in order, spines up, sorted by size. She folded the robes, 3 of them, the required black ones, new enough that they still held the shape of their packaging, and set them on top. The pewter cauldron went in its carrying bag. The glass phials were wrapped in his old-school socks to prevent breaking. The telescope extended in its case. The brass scales she wrapped in a jumper. His, one of the Dudley hand-me-downs, which would do as padding. She was methodical. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. She closed the trunk and latched it, and left the room. She did not explain when she saw him next. He looked at her when she came downstairs, and she looked at him and she thought, briefly, that she saw him understand, saw something register and be held without comment. In that way he had, which was new, or possibly not new. Possibly it had always been there, and she had not been looking. He didn't thank her. She wouldn't have known what to do if he had. Petunia drove him to King's Cross. She parked at the curb, and they got the trunk out of the boot without assistance, and she stood for a moment on the pavement outside the station entrance with her hands at her sides, looking at him the way she had developed a habit of looking at him this summer, directly, and then away, and then somewhere else. The morning was grey, and the station was full of the sounds of an ordinary September Tuesday. "Platform 9 3/4, she said. "Between 9 and 10. Don't be late." He looked at her. She had known the platform number. He had not known that she knew the platform number. It made a sudden and complete kind of sense. She had stood on this pavement, probably every September for 7 years, watching Lily go. She would have known the platform number the way she knew all the things she never mentioned, precisely, and without acknowledgement. "I won't," he said. She nodded once. Then she got back in the car. He watched the car until it was gone, and then he picked up his trunk and his owl's cage. Hagrid had given him a snow-white owl in Diagon Alley, which he had not yet named, and went into the station. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 looked, from the front, exactly like a wall. This was, presumably, the point. Harry stood in front of it for a moment with his trolley and watched a family with red hair move toward it. 4 of them, a woman and 3 boys and a girl. And then the tallest boy hit the barrier at a purposeful walk and was gone. Harry watched the gap close and took a breath and walked forward, and the barrier was not there. And then there was a platform, and the platform had a train on it. The Hogwarts Express was red in the way that things were red when they were being serious about it, a red that admitted no compromise. It was a proper steam engine of the sort that existed in the world mainly as memory, and it was enormous, and the platform was full of people in varying states of farewell or excitement, and for the first time since the night Petunia had sat across from him at the kitchen table, Harry felt something that was not entirely calculation. He felt, very briefly, like a boy arriving at something. He loaded his trunk and found an empty compartment toward the middle of the train, and sat down. The white owl rustled and settled. He looked out the window at the platform going about its business. One of the red-haired boys knocked on the compartment door not long after. "Do you mind?" He was tall and thin, with freckles and a long nose, and the expression of someone hoping the answer was no. "Everywhere else is full." "Go ahead," Harry said. The boy sat down across from him with evident relief and produced a sandwich from a paper bag and looked at it with mild resentment. He had a rat in his pocket, or the pocket had a rat in it, a grey, rather aged-looking creature that appeared to be asleep. "Ron Weasley," the boy said. "Harry Potter." The effect this had was not quite the same as the effect it had apparently had in Diagon Alley. Ron's expression cycled through several things and landed somewhere between interest and a question he was trying to decide how to ask. "Are you really?" "I think so," Harry said. "Only everyone knows about... my mum said..." He stopped himself. "Sorry. That's rude. Can I see your scar?" Harry pushed his fringe back. Ron looked at it with the honest curiosity of someone who found things interesting and didn't feel the need to pretend otherwise, and then nodded and sat back and offered Harry a corned beef sandwich, which Harry accepted because he hadn't eaten since breakfast, and corned beef sandwiches were corned beef sandwiches. They talked the way that people talked on trains when they had several hours ahead of them, and nothing pressing to do except exist in the same space. Ron seemed to know a considerable amount about the wizarding world. He had 5 older brothers and a sister, all witches and wizards, and had grown up with Quidditch on the radio and his father's professional enthusiasm for muggles, and he spoke about all of it with the unconscious ease of someone who had never had to learn it as a foreign language. Harry had spent August reading. Neither of them was starting from nothing, which made the conversation less about filling gaps and more about finding out what the other one knew. "You know what house you want?" Ron asked. He was on the subject of houses with the interest of someone who had opinions. "I know what the houses are," Harry said. This was, he had found, the relevant distinction. "I don't know which one I'll be in." "Gryffindor," Ron said, with the certainty of someone whose entire family had been in one house and considered it less a choice than a fact of nature. Hopefully. You're not bothered either way?" Harry thought about this. He was not ready to say the thing he was actually thinking, which was that he knew his mother had been in Gryffindor, and that this was the only specific information he had about houses and people he cared about. He said, "Not exactly bothered. Just not sure yet." Ron seemed to find this reasonable, and moved on to the subject of Quidditch, on which he had extensive views. The girl knocked on the compartment door some time before they reached the border. She was brown-haired and had the look of someone who had approached the day with a detailed plan and was executing it efficiently. "Have you seen a toad?" she asked, by way of introduction. "A boy named Neville's lost one." She looked around the compartment, confirmed the absence of toads, and then appeared to notice Harry. "Oh, you're Harry Potter." "Yes," Harry said. She did not stop to register this beyond the initial notation. She said, "I'm Hermione Granger," and sat down without particularly being invited, which Harry found immediately agreeable. "I've read all our textbooks already." "Have you?" "Most of them," Harry said. "The potions one, twice." This produced, for the first time, something that looked like genuine interest rather than cataloguing. "The potions one is interesting," she said. "The history of magic one is less so. The author seems to have been very impressed with himself." Ron looked between the two of them with the expression of someone watching a game he had not realized was being played. The train moved north. The landscape outside the window changed the way landscapes changed when you were leaving one version of England for another. The green deepened, and the sky got bigger, and then the sky got smaller again, as hills became the dominant feature, and the hills got darker, and the towns fell away and left only the land. Harry watched it for a while, and stopped talking, and just looked. He thought about his mother. She had done this every September for 7 years, 1971, then 1972, then each year after, until 1978. She had sat on a train like this one and watched this landscape come. She had been 11 the first time, the same age Harry was now, and she had been good at it from the first day, Hagrid had said, had walked in like she'd been there before. Harry watched the hills. He thought about that, walking into something and feeling like you'd been there before. He did not know yet if that was what he felt. He knew only that he was on the same train on the same route to the same school, and that he was not a stranger here in the way he had been a stranger everywhere else. He was the second member of his family to arrive. The first had loved it. The landscape kept going dark. Hermione had produced a book. Ron had gone back to his sandwiches. The owl made a small sound and resettled. When the announcement came and the lights changed and people began to move and Harry's stomach tightened in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, he was ready. He had been ready, in one way or another, since a Monday evening in late July, when a woman had sat across from him at a kitchen table and said her name was Lily. He put on his robes in the small changing area with a group of other first years who were mostly frightened, or performing not being frightened, or doing some combination of the two. He did not think he was frightened. He thought he was alert, which was a different thing. The train slowed. The platform came into view. Outside, in the dark and the cold, someone was calling for the first years, and the voice was enormous, and Harry knew it. He climbed down onto the platform and looked up. Hagrid. The boats were small, and the lake was enormous, and Hogwarts came at them out of the dark like something that had been waiting. Harry had expected it to be large. He had read enough to know that the castle sat in the Scottish Highlands and was ancient and extensive, and he had constructed, from those facts, a reasonable approximation in his mind. The approximation was wrong. Not in scale exactly. He had known it would be big, but in quality. It was not large the way buildings were large. It was large the way weather was large, a thing you were inside rather than a thing you were looking at. The towers went up into the dark, and the lights came from inside windows that were set at heights that made no immediate architectural sense, and it sat beside the water that surrounded them, and it did not seem to be doing this for any reason other than that it had always been here and would continue to be. He stopped rowing. Someone else's oar hit his. "Watch it," Ron muttered from the next boat. Harry watched it. They came off the boats in a long, stumbling procession on slick stone steps, and were herded, by Hagrid first, and then by interior mechanisms of the castle itself, or possibly by the sheer layout of the place, into a chamber off the entrance hall where they stood in a cluster, while their collective nerves quietly interfered with each other. Harry stood near the back. He was not nervous, or not in the way that several people around him were clearly nervous. He was still in the mode he had been in since the platform, alert, oriented, taking stock. The door opened, and McGonagall came in. She was tall and black-haired, the hair pulled up in a severe bun, and she wore square spectacles and emerald-green robes, and an expression that had very precise expectations of everyone in the room, and was prepared to wait, at some cost to its patience, to see if those expectations would be met. Harry had expected her too, the way he had expected things this whole journey, not in detail but in type. She was a type he recognized. He had grown up in a house that ran on the same principle. Order and rule, and the implicit message that these things were for your benefit, whether you wanted them to be or not. He did not find her frightening. He found her exactly correct. She gave them the information about the sorting and the houses, and what was expected of them, and what the houses were, and what was at stake for the house points, and then she left them to it for a few minutes, and the few minutes were occupied by the people who found this situation frightening, doing their frightening visibly, and Harry looking at the stone wall and thinking about nothing in particular. The door opened again. He followed the others in. The Great Hall was the Great Hall. He had read about it, and now he was in it, and the ceiling was what you noticed first, because the ceiling was the sky, or a very convincing version of the sky, or the sky as seen through some enchantment that removed the practical obstacle of a ceiling. It was dark and full of stars, and there were hundreds of candles floating at various heights that cast the long tables below in a flickering warmth. He took all of this in approximately 1 second, and then he looked at the staff table. Dumbledore was easy to find. Very long silver hair, very long silver beard, half-moon spectacles sitting on a crooked nose, and robes of a purple deep enough to be visible even at this distance. He sat near the center of the table, with the bearing of someone who had been sitting in this room for a very long time, and found it exactly suited to him. Harry had been thinking about this man since July, since the kitchen table, since the 2 letters in the drawer, and the question of what Petunia had and had not been given by the person who sat up there at the head of things. He was expecting something. He wasn't sure what. Something that looked more like a man who had declined a 9-year-old girl's request to attend his school, who had sent a baby to a house on a Surrey street with a letter explaining the terms. What he got was a pair of eyes that found him across the Great Hall almost immediately, and that were, underneath everything, kind. Harry looked away first. The sorting hat sang. Harry listened with half his attention. The other half was on the room, on the students at the 4 tables, already seated, watching the new first years with various degrees of interest. The hat's song described each house's qualities: courage and nerve for Gryffindor, patience and loyalty for Hufflepuff, wit and learning for Ravenclaw, cunning and ambition for Slytherin. And when it finished, the room applauded, and then the list began. Hermione went early, her name coming near the front of the alphabet. She sat on the stool, and the hat had barely settled over her bushy hair when it shouted, "Gryffindor," and she walked to the Gryffindor table with the expression of someone who had expected this outcome and was pleased it had been confirmed. Neville Longbottom was round-faced and uncertain, and nearly dropped the hat before he got it onto his head. It sat there a while, considering. Neville gripped the sides of the stool. The whole of the Great Hall waited with the mixture of mild awkwardness and genuine goodwill that was the specific texture of watching someone take longer than expected. Then the hat called Gryffindor, and Neville walked to the table with the expression of someone who had feared a different answer and was still absorbing the relief. Draco Malfoy went to the stool with the manner of someone who considered the exercise a formality. He was pale and sharp-featured with platinum blonde hair, and the hat had barely touched his head before it announced Slytherin. He walked to the green and silver table without any visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction. Then someone called Potter. The hall changed in a way that was subtle and total. He felt it rather than observed it. Something in the quality of the attention turning toward him as he walked forward felt different from the attention it had been paying to anyone else. He sat on the stool. The hat came down over his eyes. The darkness inside the hat was warmer than he had expected. Something searched through him. He did not know how else to describe it. It was not invasive exactly, more like a very thorough look taken at things he was already aware of. He felt it find ambition, which he did have, though not in the form he suspected was usual. He felt it find the thing that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, that had been living in him since he was old enough to understand that he was kept deliberately ignorant of who he was. He felt it find the particular stubbornness of a person who had spent 10 years deciding what to do with what they'd been given and making something systematic out of it. The hat was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then it said, loudly and without apparent reservation, Gryffindor. The table on the far left erupted. Harry walked toward it, and someone, Ron, who had apparently been sorted somewhere in the middle of Harry's thinking and had made it to Gryffindor, which surprised no one, grabbed his arm and pulled him into a seat, and people were saying his name and shaking his hand, and Percy, who turned out to be Ron's brother and a prefect, said well done in a formal way that suggested he took the role seriously, and Harry sat through all of this and heard almost none of it. He was thinking about a fact no one had given him yet. "Did you know," Ron said, when things had settled slightly and the noise had redistributed itself down the table, "that your mum was in Gryffindor?" Harry looked at him. "My mum told me," Ron said, with the easy familiarity of someone who mentioned mothers without complication. "She said Lily Evans was in Gryffindor. Your mum, I mean. Before she was your mum." He seemed to realize he was over-explaining and stopped. "Thought you might want to know, is all." Harry looked down at the table in front of him. There was food on it now. It had appeared at some point while the sorting was finishing, in the way things apparently appeared here, between one moment and the next. Gryffindor. His mother had been in Gryffindor. Petunia had given him her name, and her hair and her eyes. She had not given him the house. Maybe she hadn't known. Maybe she had known, and it hadn't seemed like the relevant detail. Or maybe some things were harder to give than others, for reasons Harry couldn't see from the outside. It didn't matter now. He had it now. He had been sorted into the same house as his mother, and he was sitting at her table, and the ceiling above him was the same sky she had eaten under for 7 years. He picked up a fork. At the front of the hall, Dumbledore rose to speak. He said a few things. Welcome, important announcements, a list of items that were forbidden, the word nitwit, which produced laughter, and his voice carried the warmth of someone who was genuinely pleased by what he was looking at. Harry watched him across the candlelight, the old man who had written Petunia a kind letter, who had put a baby on a doorstep with a letter explaining what needed to be done, who sat up there now under the enchanted sky and found Harry's face in the crowd the way he had in the first moment, and whose eyes, even at this distance, still had the thing Harry hadn't expected. He didn't know yet what to do with this. He looked back at his plate and ate his dinner, and let the noise of the table move around him. And he thought, this is the room. This is the ceiling she looked at. This is the house she was in. He was not a stranger here. He was somewhere he was supposed to be. The moving staircases were not in the books. Harry had read a considerable amount about Hogwarts over the course of August, and none of it had adequately covered the staircases, which changed direction while you were on them, sometimes with warning and sometimes without, and which led to different places, depending on factors he had not yet identified. He was fairly certain the third-floor corridor had a staircase that moved in a pattern, but he had not yet worked out what the pattern was, and until he did, he was taking a longer route to Transfiguration that involved 2 extra flights and a portrait who gave him unsolicited opinions about his hair. He was not lost the way he might have been. But he was not oriented either, which was a different kind of not lost, the kind where you know approximately where you are and still cannot get there without effort. He spent the first week making mental maps and revising them, and discovering that revision was ongoing. The castle was his mother's castle. He walked its corridors with this knowledge present in some background register of his mind, like a low note beneath a more complicated piece of music. She had been lost here too, probably, in September 1971, and then less lost, and then not lost at all. He was somewhere in the early stage of that arc. McGonagall's Transfiguration class was in a room that had a view of the grounds and smelled of chalk and something older underneath it. McGonagall arrived precisely at the time she had said she would arrive, and surveyed the assembled first years with the expression she apparently always had, which was the expression of someone who held themselves and others to the same standard, and was prepared to demonstrate what that standard looked like. She turned her desk into a pig and back again, without theatrical preamble. And then she said that Transfiguration was some of the most complex and dangerous magic taught at Hogwarts, and she said it in the tone of someone who found this fact interesting rather than alarming, and that was a great deal more informative about the class than the words themselves. Harry had read about Transfiguration. He had read the theory of it, the principles, the underlying logic of changing one thing into another. He had found it fascinating, in the same way he found the potions text fascinating, not as entertainment, but as architecture, a system he could learn the grammar of. But reading about it and watching it happen were different. And when McGonagall changed the desk back from the pig, and it was simply a desk again, he had the same feeling he'd had in Diagon Alley. All the reading in the world didn't mean he had imagined this correctly. He took notes. Other students were discovering things for the first time. He was recognizing things. The distinction turned out to matter. Recognizing was faster, but it was not easier, because recognition came with expectation, and expectation created its own pressure. He knew this should work a certain way, and then it didn't work that way, and he had to figure out the gap between what he understood and what he could do, which was a harder gap to manage than pure ignorance. He practiced the matchstick. It did not become a needle by the end of the class. He got an end of it to go metallic, which was more than some people managed, and less than he'd hoped for. Potions was on Thursday. The dungeon was cold the way things were cold underground, with a particular quality of moisture in the stone, and it was lit by torches that managed to make the cold visible. Preserved animals in jars lined the walls, and Harry looked at them briefly, and then at the floor. There were cauldrons on the work tables, and the smell was something he hadn't been able to imagine from reading. Layered, specific, demanding to be categorized. He thought, this is where she was brilliant. He sat down and put his things on the table. The room went quiet in a specific way. The way a room went quiet when someone arrived in it who expected silence, and the expectation was sufficient to produce it. And Severus Snape walked to the front of the classroom. He was thin and very pale, with sallow skin that suggested someone who spent considerable time in dungeons and not much time elsewhere. His hair was black and shoulder-length and had the quality of not being entirely clean, though it was not disordered. It fell straight and was clearly simply left where it fell. His nose was hooked, and his eyes, when they moved across the room, were very black and moved in the way that eyes moved when they were deciding something about what they saw, rather than simply observing. He wore black robes that swept the floor. He did not appear to be making any effort with his entrance. The effort was the room's, which had rearranged itself for him without being asked. He said some things about potions. He said them the way someone spoke, who found the subject important, and found the student's comprehension of its importance insufficient, and had made a tentative peace with this. Harry listened to all of it. He had read the textbook twice, but he listened as though he hadn't, because there was something useful in hearing someone who actually knew the subject speak about it that was different from reading about it, even if the content overlapped. Then Snape took the roll. He called the names in a flat voice that moved through them alphabetically, and each name received the same treatment until he reached Potter. He said it, and he looked up. Harry looked back at him. He did not look like someone who had complicated feelings about a woman with red hair and green eyes, but Harry did not know he was supposed to be looking for that. What Harry saw was a man with very black eyes who had paused on his name and was looking at him with an attention that seemed to be building a profile rather than acknowledging an attendance. It was not the attention of someone who was surprised, which was what Harry had noticed. Most people, when they recognized him, showed some fraction of surprise, even if they'd been expecting him. Snape showed nothing. He looked at Harry the way you looked at something you had known about for a long time and had formed a view on. Harry thought, I am in this room because my mother loved this room. He thought this quietly, as a private fact. He held it and let Snape's gaze move on. The questions came after the roll. Snape turned from the board and pointed at Harry. Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? The room went very still. Harry knew the word asphodel. He had read it. He did not, at this moment, have access to what it did with wormwood. He went through the potions textbook in his memory, with the rapid and increasingly unsatisfying feeling of a person who had read something and cannot locate it in the moment they need it most. I don't know, he said. Thought not? Snape did not look disappointed. He looked like someone whose expectation had been confirmed. Let's try again. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? A bezoar. He had read about bezoars. He thought he had read about bezoars. He was fairly certain a bezoar was a stone, which was an unusual thing for a stone to be, which was why he remembered it. But he could not, under the particular quality of Snape's attention in this specific dungeon at this specific moment, produce the rest of it. I don't know, he said again. Clearly fame is not everything. Snape's voice did not change register. One more. What is the difference between Monkshood and Wolfsbane? There was no difference. He knew this one. He knew it because he had read it, and the fact had stayed because there was something almost funny about a plant having 3 names, which was a thing he remembered about plants. Monkshood and Wolfsbane were the same plant, also called aconite. He didn't say this. He did not say it because by the 3rd question he had understood what was happening in the room. He was being demonstrated to the class, not because Snape had selected him for individual instruction, but because his name had the quality his name had, and the gap between what was expected and what he could produce was itself the lesson. He understood this with a cold clarity, and he decided in that same moment not to hand over the one answer he had. He thought, looking at Snape, my mother would have known all 3. He said, "I don't know, sir." Ron found him outside the dungeon afterward and said, "He does that to everyone their first lesson," which was generous and possibly true, and also was not the specific thing Harry was feeling, which was not what Ron thought it was. Harry said thanks and that he'd see him at lunch, and they went separate ways. He carried the class alone through the rest of the afternoon. He did not know who Snape was to his mother. He knew Snape was the potions master. He knew his mother had been brilliant in this subject. He did not know what the shape of their relationship had been, or whether it had had a shape at all. He thought, probably, that it didn't matter for now. What mattered was that he had been in the room where she had excelled, and he had not excelled, and the gap between her and him felt specific in a way it had not felt abstract. He would learn. That was what he thought. He would read the textbook a third time. That evening he found parchment and a quill at the common room table and sat down to write. He addressed it to Petunia Dursley, which took him longer than addressing something should take, because it required deciding that this was happening, that he was going to write to her, as a thing that people did, as a thing he was doing. He dipped the quill. He wrote, "I am in Gryffindor." Then he stopped. He sat there with the quill held just above the parchment and thought about what those words would do when they arrived through the letter slot at Fort Privet Drive. He thought about whether she would open the envelope. He thought she would. He thought about whether she would understand what Gryffindor meant. He thought about her at 9 years old, writing to a headmaster she had never met. And he thought about her standing at the kitchen window, saying she was impossible. And he thought about a trunk packed with mathematical efficiency by hands that hadn't explained themselves. She would understand. He was as certain of this as he was certain of almost nothing. She would understand it better than almost anyone, because she was the only person in his life who had been present for the whole length of what he was only now beginning. He looked at the 5 words on the parchment for a moment longer. Then he folded it. He would send it in the morning. Several weeks into term, Harry had assembled the following facts about Albus Dumbledore. He was approximately 110 years old, which was not a thing Harry had had a framework for before, coming to Hogwarts, and still didn't, quite, have a framework for. He had been headmaster for a very long time. He appeared at every meal in the Great Hall, with the punctuality of someone who considered meal times important, and he spoke at the start of each with the warmth of someone who genuinely liked the people he was speaking to. His robes were various and always slightly remarkable. His eyes were very blue, and they did the thing that Harry had noticed on the first night. The looking, the real looking, that most people either couldn't or didn't do. Harry had been watching him for several weeks, from the Gryffindor table, from the corridors, once from a staircase, where he had paused to let a group of older students pass, and Dumbledore had crossed the hall below without looking up, the silver of his hair catching the torchlight in a way that made him look, for a moment, genuinely old. Not old as in ancient, which was how Harry had been thinking of him. Old in the way people were old. A long time of things accumulated in a person, until the person was mostly that. He had been trying for several weeks to formulate a question. The question kept refusing to be one thing. It was several things, or it was one thing with several faces, and the faces were, "You wrote my aunt a letter when she was 9 years old, and then you put me on her doorstep 10 years later with another letter, and she obeyed both of them for a decade, and at no point in any of this did you tell me anything. And I want to understand the logic of that." He had not found a way to reduce this to something he could say in a corridor without sounding accusatory or unhinged or both. He decided in the 3rd week of October to try anyway. After dinner on a Thursday, he went not to the common room, but up toward the 7th floor, past the staircase that moved, and along a corridor that led toward the part of the castle that housed the headmaster's office. He didn't try to go in. He didn't know the password, and he hadn't planned to know it. He had planned to be near. He had planned to be visible in the corridor at an hour when the headmaster might also be in the corridor, and to see what happened. He sat on a window seat with a view of the grounds, and took out a charms essay he had not finished, and read the same paragraph several times without absorbing it. After perhaps 20 minutes, he heard footsteps. Dumbledore came around the corner carrying nothing and walking at the pace of someone with no particular destination, who was thoroughly content about this. He saw Harry immediately, and he did not look surprised, which Harry had been half expecting, and which still landed with some weight. "Mr. Potter," he said. "Professor," Harry said. And then, because he had been working up to this for 3 weeks, "Could I ask you something?" Dumbledore regarded him for a moment with the blue eyes that did their genuine looking. "I think you could," he said. "Would you like to walk?" They walked. The corridor looped back toward a landing that had windows on both sides and a view of the grounds in the dark, and they stood there, and Harry asked. "You wrote my aunt a letter," he said, "when she was 9 years old." He paused. "You wrote back to her, to say she couldn't come to Hogwarts." "I did," Dumbledore said. He said it without elaboration. He did not offer a preamble or a justification. He simply confirmed it in the way that someone confirmed things they had done and had not stopped having done. "What did you say to her?" Harry asked. "Besides the no." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone choosing carefully, more the quiet of someone genuinely considering what the right words were. "I told her," he said at last, "what I tell anyone who finds themselves at a door that will not open for them, that some doors are not ours to open, and that this is not the same thing as having been turned away, that the world contains more rooms than any door." Harry thought about this. He thought about Petunia at 9 years old, receiving that letter and reading those particular words and what she would have done with them, and he thought the answer was probably kept them, reread them, and spent 30 years declining to be consoled by them. "She kept the letter," he said. "I suspected she might." Harry looked at him. "You suspected she might keep it for 30 years? "People who want something very much," Dumbledore said, "tend to keep the evidence of having wanted it. It is not always comfortable, but it is very human." He looked out at the dark grounds. "Your aunt is a person of considerable internal consistency." Harry thought this was one of the more exact things anyone had said about Petunia, and that it had been said by a man who had met her, as far as Harry could tell, exactly never. "Did you know what she would do with it?" he asked. "The letter. Did you know she would show it to me?" "No," Dumbledore said, and Harry believed him. There was no hesitation in the word, and no softening of it, which was the answer's most convincing quality. "I wrote to Petunia in 1981 with a great deal of trust in her capacity for doing what was difficult because it was necessary. She had demonstrated that capacity before, in her childhood, in fact, when she wrote to me. She did not ask for easy things. She asked for what she thought was right." He paused. "I trusted her with you on that basis. I trusted her with considerably more than I sometimes acknowledged. What she chose to do with all of it was her own." A brief pause, and then, "I am very glad she told you." The twinkling that Harry had noticed on the first night was present now, quiet in the lamplight from a wall sconce somewhere behind them. It was not the expression of someone who had everything in hand. It was the expression of someone who had encountered a fact they were genuinely pleased by. Harry had been looking for the right approach to the last question for 3 weeks. He had not found a better one than asking it directly. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he said. The silence that followed was not evasive. Dumbledore had the quality, Harry had noticed, of silences that were doing something, not avoiding, but considering. "Because the truth, in your case, is also a weapon," Dumbledore said at last. "And weapons require their owners to be ready to carry them. I made a judgment that you were not yet ready, that the weight of knowing what you are and what happened to your parents was a weight that ought to be introduced at the correct moment with the correct support. I was not certain when that moment would be." He looked at Harry directly. "I was wrong to hold that judgment as long as I did. Your aunt understood something I had not fully accounted for, that you were not the only person who needed the truth to be told." Harry thought about Petunia at the kitchen table, the overhead light, the 2 envelopes. "You're not apologizing," he said. "No," Dumbledore agreed. "I think it would be dishonest to apologize for a decision I made in good faith, simply because it was imperfect. I can acknowledge that it was imperfect. I do acknowledge it." He looked at Harry with something that was not quite an apology, and was, Harry thought, more useful than one. "You have the truth now. You have had it for several months, and from a source that I believe has given it a weight and a texture it would not have had coming from me. I am not sorry, you know. I am sorry it took as long as it did." Harry stood with this for a moment. He thought about whether this was satisfying, and he found it was. Not in the way he had expected, which was more conclusive, but in the way that honest things were satisfying, incompletely, with room for more questions later. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for asking," Dumbledore said, which Harry had not expected. They stood there a moment longer, and then Dumbledore made the small motion that indicated the conversation had come to its natural end, and Harry turned to go. "Mr. Potter." He turned back. Dumbledore looked at him across the lamplight, with the very blue eyes and the very long beard and the face of someone who had been accumulating time for 110 years and had found, somewhere in it, what was worth saying. "Your mother," he said, "would have asked the same questions." He said it the way you said a fact, without ornamentation, without the weight of someone delivering a gift they wanted you to notice. Just a thing that was true, offered because it was true. Harry walked back toward Gryffindor Tower. He did not think clearly on the way. He thought in fragments, the word questions and the word same, and the image of a woman he had never met sitting in a dungeon classroom answering 3 potions questions that he had not been able to answer, and the fact that she had been 11 when she came here and had walked in like she'd been there before. He thought about the word same. He had her eyes. He had her house. He had, apparently, her particular approach to people who had information he needed. He thought, I am not only the boy in the cupboard. I am also that. He went to bed carrying it. At 4 Privet Drive, the post arrived on a Wednesday morning. Petunia took it from the mat, as she always took it. The bills and the catalogue and the newsletter from the church, sorted in the hallway in order of what needed responding to. Among them was an envelope she did not recognize immediately. And then she did. The parchment, the yellowish color, the green ink. The owl had apparently left it on the front step and departed before she'd heard it. She stood in the hallway and opened it. Inside was a single line. I am in Gryffindor. She read it. She read it again. The handwriting was not good. Scratchy, a child's handwriting with a quill it hadn't fully mastered. But the words were legible, and the words were correct, and the name at the bottom was Harry, which was not his full name, but was what he had signed. She stood in the hallway for a moment, and did not cry. This was not an effort. It simply did not happen. She was not built for crying in hallways about letters. She was built for other things. She went to the kitchen. She opened the third drawer and moved the rubber bands and the dried pens and found what her hand had always known how to find. She put the two things together in the drawer, the old envelope with Dumbledore's handwriting on the outside and the new parchment with 5 words on it, and she closed the drawer. She stood there a moment with her hand on the handle. Then she went to put the kettle on and did what she always did, which was the next thing, and the thing after that, and the thing after that. He woke up knowing what day it was. This was not remarkable in itself. He knew what day it was most mornings, as a function of having a schedule and a calendar, and the ordinary mechanisms of a person living in time. What was different was the quality of the knowing. He had been counting toward October 31st, since August, the way you counted toward something you needed to get to, rather than something you wanted. He had not known the date before Hagrid told him. Petunia had said they died. She had not said when. Hagrid had said when. October 31st. Harry had set the date down in himself carefully and left it alone, and now it was here. 10 years exactly. He had been 15 months old. He got dressed in the ordinary way and went to breakfast in the ordinary way and sat through his morning classes with his attention divided between what was in front of him and the stone he was carrying in the pocket of his understanding, which was smooth and heavy and did not go away when he pressed other things against it. The castle had been decorated overnight. Giant jack-o'-lanterns lined the corridors, lit from within by candles that flickered without wind. The ceiling of the great hall at lunchtime was dark even in the middle of the day, patterned with enchanted bats that moved with the unhurried certainty of creatures who had been told the ceiling was theirs. Other students found this atmospheric and enjoyable, and said so. Harry thought the bats were well done. He was not wrong to think about it. That was the thing he kept coming back to, in the gaps between lessons, in the hallways between one place and another. He was not wrong to be carrying this. He had the right to it. He had been given the right to it by a woman who had sat down at a kitchen table on a late July evening and told him the truth. And he was using it, which was what you did with rights that people gave you at some cost to themselves. He went to the Halloween feast. The great hall was the most elaborate it had been in the 2 months he had been here. Thousands of candles in the air, the ceiling gone dark with a moving sky, 1,000 bats above the enchanted ones, and the 4 house tables loaded with food that had appeared at the flick of Dumbledore's smile at the head of things. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table in his mother's house and served himself something and ate it and watched the room. He was thinking about the fact that she had done this too. Sat at this table, on this date, at some point during her 7 years. Had she known, by the time she was the age Harry was now, that October 31st would become the day that it became? Had she known, sitting in this room, that she was still only at the beginning of a story that would end badly and begin again, here, in the same hall, in the same house, 10 years later, in him? She hadn't known. Nobody knew what was coming. That was the ordinary human condition, and it applied even here, even to witches who were brilliant from their first day. He was thinking about this when Professor Quirrell burst through the doors. He was white, not startled. White, the white of a man who had encountered something and been changed by the encounter, and was working very hard to make the room understand the same thing. He said there was a troll. He said it was in the dungeons. He said he thought everyone ought to know, and then he crumpled against the doorframe, and the Great Hall did the thing the Great Hall did when it received bad news, which was to become very loud and then become very organized at McGonagall's voice. Everyone was to go back to their dormitories, immediately, in an orderly fashion. Harry stood up with the Gryffindor table. He looked at Ron, who looked back at him. They had both arrived at the same thought at approximately the same moment, which was Hermione. She had been crying in the girls' bathroom on the first floor for most of the afternoon. Ron had said something unfortunate during Charms, and Harry had watched her leave, and Harry had not done anything about it, which was now a decision he was undoing. He fell sideways out of the column of Gryffindors heading upstairs, and Ron followed him without discussion. They found the bathroom by the trail of the smell first. Something damp and cave-like that did not belong in a stone corridor, but was very present in one. And then they found the door. And then they opened it. And there was Hermione, pressed into the corner by the sinks. And there was the troll, which was 12 feet tall, and moved with the disorienting slowness of something that size, as though it was conserving the effort its own existence required. Harry had a lit wand in his hand before he had decided to light it, which was the first time his wand had done something that fast. Ron hit the troll in the head with its own club, using a charm they had spent 3 lessons on, and which he performed, under these particular circumstances, correctly. The club came down on the troll's head, with a sound Harry did not have a reference for. The troll went down onto the tiles. The 3 of them stood there in the sudden quiet. McGonagall came in with Snape and Quirrell behind her, and her expression moved through several things before arriving at controlled fury, and she asked what they were doing there, and Hermione, who was still against the sink but was no longer pressed against it, had straightened, and whom Harry could see making a decision, said she had gone looking for the troll herself. She said she had read about them, and thought she could handle it. She said it was her fault entirely. Harry looked at the floor. McGonagall said things about rule-breaking and foolhardiness, gave them 5 points each for presence of mind, and removed 5 from Hermione for recklessness, and then the troll was dealt with, and the bathroom was cleared, and they walked back toward Gryffindor Tower in the aftermath of it, the 3 of them, not talking much. Hermione looked at Harry and Ron at the portrait hole and said, "Thank you," very quietly, with the particular quality of someone who understood exactly what had just happened and what it meant. They went in. They were counted and accounted for. The common room sorted itself out into small groups of people processing the evening and comparing experiences. Harry sat in an armchair for a while, and then, when no one particularly needed him to be anywhere, he went upstairs. He was alone for the first time in hours. He thought about his parents. He knew their names. Lily and James. He knew their faces from the inside rather than from outside, assembled from descriptions rather than seen, the way you knew a landscape from a map before you visited. Dark red hair and bright green eyes for Lily, which he knew because they were his green eyes, mirror-imaged. Jet-black, messy hair and hazel eyes, and glasses for James, which he knew because they were his own hair on a face he had never seen. He had not seen a photograph of either of them. He would at some point. He understood there would be photographs, that they had existed in the world long enough to be photographed, that there were people who had taken those photographs and kept them. But not yet. He knew their faces from other people's words, and that was how he knew them for now. He thought about the night it happened. October 31st, 1981, in a house in Godric's Hollow, a place he had never been, which had been a home before it wasn't, which was now a ruin visible to wizards and hidden from muggles, which had been standing when they were alive and was still standing in a different form after they weren't. He thought about the year he had been when it happened. 15 months. He thought about what 15 months looked like. Very small, probably, and loud when upset, and not capable of carrying anything. He was carrying things now. She had given him that. He thought about Petunia at 9 years old. He did this when he needed to get the shape of something. Came back to the image of the 9-year-old at a table with a sheet of paper, writing to a headmaster she had never met, asking for the thing she wanted most. It was a very specific act of courage, the kind that was not recognized as courage because it was small and private and ended in a no. He thought about Lily at 9 years old, a year or two before she got the letter that said yes, probably setting something on fire by accident in the kitchen of a house in Cokeworth and being delighted by it, which was what Harry imagined when he imagined Lily discovering magic, though he did not know if it had happened that way. 2 sisters. One world opened its doors for one of them, and not the other, and the one it didn't open for had spent 30 years holding the evidence of the closed door in the 3rd drawer of the kitchen, and had opened the right door to Harry instead, when the time came. He had thought about writing this letter for weeks. He got up and found parchment and a quill, and sat at the small desk by the window, and looked at the dark grounds for a while, thinking about what to put. He had decided, at some point in the last few weeks, that this letter was not going to say everything. It was not going to explain what had changed for him, or what he understood now that he hadn't understood before, because that was too large for a letter, and Petunia, in his estimation, already knew most of it. She had been there for the whole length of it. She did not need the explanation. What she needed was, or what felt right, which was close enough, was to know that today was today, and that he was counting from the same date she was, and that she was not the only person in the world who had been carrying October 31st around for 10 years like a stone in a pocket. He dipped the quill. Today is October 31st. Thank you for telling me their names. He signed it Harry and folded it and sent it with the school owl before he could change his mind about the brevity of it. At 4 Privet Drive, the letter came through the door on a Friday morning. Petunia picked it up from the mat and knew it before she opened it. The parchment, the green ink, the name she had been giving herself the space not to look for in the post since September. She stood in the hallway in the ordinary morning quiet of a house where Vernon had already gone to work and Dudley had already gone to school, and she opened it. There were 2 lines. Today is October 31st. Thank you for telling me their names. She read them. She had been carrying October 31st for 10 years. She had carried it in the way she carried everything that couldn't be put down, by not referring to it directly, by moving through the day with extra precision, by keeping herself fully occupied with the tasks the day offered. Today was a Friday, and she had meant to do the weekly shopping and change the sheets in the spare room and call her neighbour about the fence, and she had not been thinking about Lily any more than she thought about Lily on any other October day, which was in the measured way she had learned to do it. She read the 2 lines again. Her face did not change. She was not a person whose face changed in hallways over letters. She was a person who read things and understood them and knew what to do. She went to the kitchen. She opened the 3rd drawer. Inside it, under everything else, Dumbledore's reply in its old envelope, the paper worn soft along the creases, and Harry's first letter, the one that had arrived in September with its 5 words. She put the new parchment in with the others. 3 letters in the drawer now. The one she wrote, or rather, the answer she received to the one she wrote. The one Harry wrote first. The one Harry wrote today. It was a small drawer. The letters did not take up much space. She had always known the drawer could hold more. She closed it. She stood there a moment with her hand flat on the front of the drawer, and she thought about Lily at 9 years old, which was something she had not let herself do in a very long time, and which she did now, briefly and without warning, like a door opening that she had not been the one to open. She had been 9, and Lily had been 8, probably, and Lily had come home from school and said she had a friend who had shown her something impossible, and Petunia had said, "That's not possible," and Lily had said, "Watch." Lily had watched the whole time. That was what Petunia remembered most. Lily had watched everything, the way she was watching now, presumably, from wherever people went when they were not anywhere. Her son in the house she had given her life to protect, carrying her name in his pocket. Petunia took her hand from the drawer. She went to put the kettle on. She went to make a list for the shopping. She went to call about the fence. She did these things, and she did them with the precise and ordinary care she brought to everything, and the drawer was closed and the 3 letters were in it, and outside the blood-protected house the street went about its Friday business, and somewhere to the north a boy who had her sister's eyes was in a castle learning the world his mother had loved, and the door that had always been closed wasn't closed anymore. It was not open exactly,